Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Hawkins. May I please have audio test?
The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3 and House Rule 11, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on any vote relating to any matter under consideration during today's markup. All amendments must be submitted to the committee, email provided in the meeting notice. As is the chair's practice, amendments that are pre-filed will be given priority consideration. We will be distributing both hard copies and electronic copies of amendments to ensure all members have access to relevant documents in this hybrid format. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and to submit additional materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 7003, the Expanding Financial Access for Underserved Communities Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 7003, a bill to amend the Federal Credit Union Act to permit credit unions to serve certain underserved areas and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 7003 is dispensed with. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7003, offered by Ms. Waters of California. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain my bill and my amendment. In recent years, we have seen more and more banking deserts emerge in communities where banks have closed branches and left town. The data says it all. Mega banks closed about 4,000 branches between 2010 and 2020. After the pandemic struck, the banking sector closed an additional 4,000 branches. The number of bank branches in underserved and rural areas declined by nearly 11% since 2012. During this same time, credit union branches have remained in these communities and have continued to serve the underserved. My legislation will allow all federal credit unions to apply to expand their field of membership and deliver financial services to these underserved communities. Currently, multiple common bond credit unions can do this, but I see no reason why all credit unions should not be able to apply to serve areas where banks are closing branches. I've heard from several local credit unions in support of the reforms in my bill, such as Connecta Federal Credit Union, which has a multiple common bond and is expanding to underserved areas, including a new branch in Watts. However, Schools First and other federal credit unions that operate with different charters would like to do the same but are prohibited from doing so under current law. Moreover, given the lessons learned from the pandemic and the PPP program, it is critical that we do more to ensure a strong recovery by expanding access to affordable financial services for small and minority-owned businesses. While low-income designated credit unions have their business loans exempted from the credit union member business lending cap, my bill would expand this to also exempt loans made to small businesses in underserved areas from the member business lending cap. I understand banks have concerns with this bill, but it would not prevent them from reopening branches in areas with few or no branches, and I encourage them to do so. This bill is not about favoring credit unions over banks. This is about expanding access and opportunity for those who are not being appropriately served by any financial institutions. I've heard committee Republicans argue against the merit of exploring public banking options to reach the unbanked and underserved. We may disagree on that, but I hope Republicans will at least support this effort to expand private market options to reach underserved communities. In fact, at a hearing where we considered this legislation, it was the Republican witness, John Burlaw, from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, who testified in support of my bill, saying, and I quote, "I applaud this type of approach. The credit union bill is a bottom-up approach to financial inclusion," quote unquote. He went on to express support for the member business lending cap exemption in the bill, saying he is opposed to, again, quote, "arbitrary cap on credit union member business lending that serves no safety and soundness purpose and exists mainly to protect banks from competition in making business loans," quote unquote. I couldn't agree more. In fact, H.R. 7003 is supported by the California and Nevada Credit Union Leagues, Credit Union National Association, and National Association of Federally Insured Credit Unions. In closing, I want to note I worked closely with Mr. Perlmutter, our Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions Subcommittee Chair, in introducing this bill, and I want to thank him and his staff for their contributions to this bill. Again, I urge all members to support H.R. 7003, and I yield back the balance of my time. Is there further discussion or amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes. to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, and yes, indeed, I move to strike the last word. And let me just say at the outset, I appreciate the goal of this bill, which is to increase financial inclusion in underserved areas. I represent some of those underserved areas in central and eastern Kentucky. This is a goal we all share, I might add. And let me just, at the outset, also just give a tip of the hat to the credit unions who are uniquely situated to provide that financial inclusion. And they do a great job of delivering services and could do so with additional help in underserved areas. And we want them to. We want credit unions to do that. We also want banks and non-banks and all kinds of lenders to do that. And I think, Madam Chair, a healthy financial ecosystem is one in which we have a diversity of financial credit providers, especially to enter this void in these banking deserts. We need credit unions. We need community banks. We need non-bank lenders. We need fintech companies. We need all kinds of lenders and credit providers to go into these underserved areas and help the people there reach their financial independence. However, it is not clear to me for the need for this particular bill, and I would just note for the Republican witness that you pointed out from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the mission of the Competitive Enterprise Institute is competition. But when we talk about a diverse financial ecosystem, what we want is a level playing field. And let's face it, my friends who are in the credit union industry, they have an advantage. And their advantage is that they don't pay taxes. They're a tax-exempt organization. The Farm Credit system, by the way, is really, in my district at least, Farm Credit, which is also tax-exempt, they're really the primary credit providers in these underserved areas, not credit unions. It's the Farm Credit system. But we need them all. We need a diversity. This bill, however, creates a new application for federal credit unions to expand their field of membership to include underserved areas, and the bill doesn't specify that a credit union would need to actually serve low and moderate income people within the underserved areas, and that's one of the problems that I have with the bill. So before expanding the reach of federal credit unions, we should be looking at the effectiveness of the current framework. For example, multiple common bond credit unions may already reach underserved communities regardless of geographic location, but with limitations on certain rural areas. In contrast, this bill would give larger, more prosperous credit unions preferential treatment in underserved areas at the expense of other community financial institutions and rural banks. In my district, most of these communities are served by Farm Credit or rural banks. Or no financial institution at all. And so I do appreciate the goal of the bill to get credit unions into areas where you don't even have a lot of access to community banks or farm credit. In addition, this bill would exempt loans made by credit unions to businesses in underserved areas from the credit union member business lending cap. We should recognize that low-income designated credit unions are already empowered to serve unbanked, underbanked, and low and moderate income populations. They are also not restricted by member business lending limits. These credit unions are already permitted, and this is an important point, they are already permitted to serve the public, and more than half of all credit unions already have a low-income designation. So there's not a clear need for this bill, and it will actually have more unintended consequences if enacted. I would ask also at this point for unanimous consent to include in the record Ranking Member Patrick McHenry's statement in opposition to this bill.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you. And in my remaining time, let me just applaud Chair Waters for introducing a bill to address a problem that I recognize as well. And that is that we do have banking deserts. We have underserved populations. I have a bill that I think would address this issue in a different way, but I think in a better way. The title of this bill that Chair Waters has introduced is the Expanding Financial Access for Underserved Communities Act. I agree with the goal of this bill, and I agree with Chair Waters. We do need to expand Financial Access to Underserved Communities Act. My bill, and Mr. Auchincloss has talked about this and has introduced a similar approach. My bill is called the Promoting Access to Capital in Underbanked Communities Act. And my bill really focuses on de novo charter formation. We need new bank formation in these underserved communities. I think there's opportunity for working together on this. I just think this is the wrong approach. Yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just going to recite a few things that my friend from Kentucky just said. It's a goal we all share. Tip of the hat to the credit unions. We want the credit unions to do that. Appreciate the goal of the bill. Agree with the goal of the bill. So just looking at the bill, this is about to expand the field of service to people that don't have it. That's why you appreciate the goal. That's why you agree with the goal. And that's what this bill does. Precisely what the goal sets forth. So, in general, if an existing federal credit union applies to the board to alter or expand the field of membership of the credit union to serve an underserved area, the credit union shall submit a business and marketing plan with such application that explains the credit union's ability and intent to serve the population of the underserved area through the change in the field of membership. That's precisely what this bill does, is precisely the goal that you share. I should go through the chair, I apologize. But to my friend from Kentucky, this is exactly what you want. So I just, looking at what underserved area means, and we all know this, and we had this in our committee, why this bill is so appropriate to reach out to different communities that are struggling. They're unbanked or underbanked, and this is one way to get to it. Now, I agree with my friend, there are lots of ways, but this certainly is one way, and it's a good way, and not one that should be blocked, if you will, because it does advance the goal that we all share. So it says underserved area defined as an investment area is defined under Section 103.16 of the Community Development, Banking, and Financial Institutions Act, and groups of continuous census tracts in which at least 85% individually qualify as low-income communities. So it could be rural, could be urban, but it's low income, and it's underserved or unserved, period. So I appreciate my friend for appreciating the goal of the bill. And I just think that Chair Waters, that this bill is one that we need to advance, that we certainly will work with our friends from the other side of the aisle, especially my friend from Kentucky, to maybe add some things to it, and we certainly can do that in rules. But this bill is a good bill. The testimony was all in favor of it at our committee hearing. And with that, unless the chair would like me to yield to her for a minute or two, I'd yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter. And let me just say, well, the time is up, and so I'm going to.
Well, I had 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I yield back.
Thank you. I'm going to call on the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, and have him recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Stile, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I will yield my time to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Thank you to my friend from Wisconsin, and I'll be brief. To engage my good friend from Colorado, I appreciate what he's saying. The point I'm trying to make is we do want credit unions, farm credits, community banks, big banks, non-bank lenders. We want fintech into these underserved banking deserts. We do. We want them all. Credit unions can do that now. What I'm saying is that what we don't want is an unfair playing field. We want a level playing field. We want the same regulatory and tax treatment for everybody so that everybody can compete. So we want to invite these organizations, and CDFIs, by the way. CDFIs do a great job in underserved areas. We want them as well. The problem we have is when you have a large, prosperous credit union come with a tax exemption coming into a rural underserved place, displacing the community bank or acquiring the community bank, eroding the tax base, that's a problem. That's a problem. And I'll yield to the gentleman on that.
Yields back. I'll yield to the gentleman.
And I appreciate that. I mean, first of all, this isn't whether credit unions should be taxed or untaxed. That's a whole different animal that really has to, deserves a lot of conversation, if you will. I'm comfortable with the system we have, but the credit union has to present a business and marketing plan to be able to reach to that new community. So there is a step in there that is required under this bill. And, if we want to add some other things, I'm sure the chair would entertain that. But there is a step that is required before the credit union can extend to the new area.
I'll reclaim my time. Happy to yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, and again, I appreciate my friend's argument, and I think this is a great conversation because I think we all agree that we need to address this issue of banking deserts. And by the way, Chair Waters, it's not just rural, it's of course suburban and urban as well. We need to address this across the board. And Chairman Meeks has a great bill on minority depository institutions. We need more de novo charters of those institutions as well. There's a lot of effort that needs to be combined here to deal with this issue. But let me just underscore the point in rural America, if I may. A recent Federal Reserve study shows that 51% of the 3,114 counties in the United States saw net declines in the number of bank branches between 2012 and 2017. And these declines in bank branches disproportionately hit rural communities. A total of 794 rural counties lost a combined 1,553 bank branches over the 5-year period. That's a 14% decline. The Fed also identified 44 counties as deeply affected by trends in bank closures and consolidation, which it defines as counties that had 10 or fewer bank branches in 2012 and lost at least 50% of those branches by 2017. 89% of the identified deeply affected counties are rural counties, including Nicholas County in my district. Why does this matter? The argument is, oh, well, we're moving online and digital banking is the new norm. We don't need these physical bank branches. Well, that's actually not the reality in rural America. Rural customers are more likely than their urban and suburban counterparts to do their banking in person at a branch. And believe it or not, and the pandemic really showed this, according to the Federal Communications Commission, 83% of the rural population had access to broadband compared to 96% of the U.S. population. So still, in rural America, online banking is just not available to a lot of people. So we need those physical bank branches. The Bank Policy Institute found that 9.9% of rural Americans lived in banking deserts, areas without a nearby bank branch, compared to 1.7% of urban Americans. Now you're saying, well, you're citing all of the data that supports this bill. Why aren't you supporting this bill? Because I want a level playing field. I want a level playing field, and because the bill that I have offered is a better solution, which is a on-ramp for de novo charters. We need more rural community banks in these areas, and we have too many regulatory barriers for them. That's why I urge Chair Waters to consider as a solution to this problem, not this bill that creates an unlevel playing field, a bill that would inadvertently displace rural community banks with a bill that would encourage more de novo charters of community banks and allow those credit unions to continue to serve in these underserved areas on a level playing field.
I reclaim, I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word and would yield my time to you to round out the conversation.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that. Mr. Barr has made the case, and he has made it in a very profound way. And he has said it over and over again that we need to have banking opportunities in rural communities, and he was even kind enough to say in urban communities also. And so I don't think there's anything that I can say better than what he has said. As a matter of fact, he tried to make the case that credit unions could go there now if they wanted to. Banks could go there now if they wanted to. Banks are not asking to go there. Banks are closing down. Banks are shutting down their branches. As a matter of fact, Banks do not want to be bothered with people that have small amounts of money, that come in out of the bank every day to check on their little deposits, that ask for loans that they're not going to give them. Banks don't want this business. And so credit unions do. They're asking us to help them. You have said you want to help the credit unions? You want to help fintech? You want to help CDFIs? You want to help branch bankers? We'll do it. Support this bill, because that's all that it takes. This bill is not about one type of financial institution or another. It is about expanding financial access to the underserved. Currently, a number of credit unions are prohibited from serving consumers in underserved areas, even if they're located there. Their field of membership and charter often limits who they can serve. And so the case has been made. And again, Mr. Barr has stated it better than anybody I've heard talk about how upset they are about these branches closing down. He had all of his stats. He had all of his information. He was well prepared to make the case, and he did. And I'm so pleased that he did. And I would ask my members to please take Mr. Barr's advice and do something about these underserved areas and encourage everybody, banks, credit unions, CDFIs, MDIs, fintechs, everybody. And so he's sending that message out today. And the best way that he can ensure that he is being understood is to support this bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Reclaiming my time, and I yield the remainder back to the chair.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair,
Who seeks recognition?
I do.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I do appreciate the debate and the discussion today. And I think that this is exactly what you would want, and I know it's what our ranking member and the gentleman, Mr. Barr, want. I have spent a good bit of time in this organization and seen where we have passed legislation, and I'm specifically speaking now about H.R. 591. Oh, we're on the wrong one. Excuse me as I walk down. That's okay. That's okay, Ed, and I listened to you and I walked down here, and I'm sorry I missed that. I would wish time as we move to 5912, and I thank the gentlewoman. I'll yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion of or amendments to H.R. 7003? Does Mr. Barr wish to support the bill more at this time? If so, we will make special opportunity for him to do so. If not, the question now occurs on approving the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no? No. Oh, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 7003 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Gentlemen, as for a recorded vote, pursuant to Section C5 of Committee Rule 3, the vote on this question is postponed. Thank you very much. Pursuant to notice, the chair now calls up H.R. 5912, close the ILC Loophole Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 5912, a bill to reform the regulation of industrial loan companies and their parent companies, and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1, short title.
Without objection, the first reading of H.R. 5912 is dispensed with. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, the sponsor of the bill, has an amendment in the nature of a substitute, copies of which have been distributed in advance to all members and are also on the dais. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5912 offered by Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and considered base text for purposes of further amendment. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of my bill to close the ILC Loophole Act, which will eliminate a regulatory exemption allowing commercial firms to operate FDIC-insured banks as industrial loan companies, or ILCs. The ILC loophole refers to the fact that ILCs are exempt from the requirements of the Bank Holding Company Act. This means that the parent company of ILCs are allowed to operate industrial or commercial enterprises and are not subject to Federal Reserve supervision. This piece of legislation will close the ILC loophole moving forward, grandfather existing ILCs with enhanced supervision, and provide a fair process for considering ILC applications that are still in process. When this loophole was created in 1987, ILCs were small and engaged in only limited deposit-taking and lending activities. However, over time, ILCs have gained essentially all of the powers of full-service commercial banks, but without the oversight or regulatory framework that governs banking institutions. And now, ILCs have opened the door for commercial and technology firms like Amazon, Facebook, or Walmart to acquire a full-service commercial bank. The ILC loophole undermines the separation of banking and commerce principle established by Congress for the U.S. banking system. This bill addresses a longstanding threat to our financial stability, a threat that prompted the House of Representatives to overwhelmingly vote on a bipartisan basis to close the ILC loophole in 2007. Then, after the 2008 financial crash, the Dodd-Frank Act required further study of ILCs and a moratorium on new ILC charters that has since expired. Just last week, Secretary Yellen confirmed to me in her testimony that she believes the financial stability risks posed by ILCs are still a serious concern and that this bill is, quote, more important than ever before, end of quote. I'm pleased that we have been able to negotiate a compromise with members to address some concerns around parent companies that have existing ILCs and their ability to transfer their ILC. I want to thank in particular Congressman Jim Himes for reaching an agreement with me that addresses his concerns while keeping the core tenets of the legislation intact. The real goal here is to prevent tech companies and other non-banking entities like Walmart from getting an ILC charter. When a parent company gets to own a bank without any oversight, that usually comes from owning a bank. It not only creates risks for our financial system, but also risks to consumers and taxpayers. The time for Congress to act is now. This committee has a rare opportunity today to significantly address the ILC loophole by passing this bipartisan piece of legislation, which has support not only from the Federal Reserve, but also from a broad coalition of consumer groups and trade associations, including the Independent Community Bankers of America, the National Association of Federally Insured Credit Unions, Credit Union National Association, the Center for Responsible Lending, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and many, many more. So I urge my colleagues to support this important bill. Thank you, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, has an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. We will pause to allow copies of the amendment to be distributed. Do you have a, do you have this?
We didn't know there was a manager's amendment at all.
You don't?
Is this the FSOC changes?
No, those are in
Okay, let's find out. Let's find out what happened to the, let's find it.
Madam Chair? I do. Madam Chairman, I'm an original co-sponsor of this H.R. 5912. We're now having a substitute to the amendment that we have not seen. And I'd like to say I might be for that. I was not included in the discussion. Nothing against Mr. Garcia. I don't hold him accountable for that at all. But here we are at the committee asking us to now mark up and vote on something we haven't even seen, including myself as a co-sponsor.
Will the gentleman yield?
So I
We
would
all
yield.
recognize that we don't have the copies of the amendment to the amendment. We're not trying to do anything but get it
Thank you.
so that you will have a copy of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Have all members received the amendment? If so, the clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5912 offered by Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Page 10, line 22. Insert subject to a hearing described under paragraph 7. Before was. Page 17. After line 20, insert the following. Evasion hearing. With respect to a product or service that the Financial Stability Oversight Council determines under paragraph 1A, I, 2.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes to explain the manager's amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I move to strike the last word. With respect to the amendment that has been offered, I want to say the following. Under this amendment and the agreement that was negotiated, any commercial entity would be eligible to apply to acquire an ILC, but this would be subject to a review by the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and they would have to comply with requirements that ensure that they don't transform the business model of the previous ILC to operate like a full-fledged bank that isn't regulated like all other banks or engage in risky activity that would undermine consumer protection or financial stability. In other words, this amendment helps provide ILCs and their parent companies more leverage with respect to any oversight that FSOC would have over issues that may arise. That is the nature of the amendment as it relates to the evasion hearing. In other words, it further strengthens the purpose and the authority that existing ILCs would have. So it helps to fortify them moving forward. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Madam Chairman, I believe that some others wanted to speak also, which would perhaps allow me, so I would like to see if they'll be recognized. I know the Chairwoman's trying to be good to me, and I did ask for this time.
Thank you very much.
I would like some of our other colleagues to speak, and I
Mr. Barr is
would like to.
recognized.
Thank you.
Mr. Huizinga is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And part of this confusion, frankly, is what's been going on. We have a new amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute. So we have an amendment to the ANS, which nobody has seen. And I would point out I have two problems. One is a policy foul here on how we need to be operating, because you've got a co-sponsor of the bill who's in the dark about an amendment. You've got members on the other side that are in the dark about an amendment. And I'm not going to speak for the other side, but I'm guessing there's a few on that side of the aisle that are in the dark about the amendment to the ANS. So now let's get to the policy foul. That's the process foul, policy foul. It appears that, if I'm reading this correctly, on page 15, under 4A, there's public comment and hearing. We are now adding, or you are, and Mr. Garcia is trying to add, on page 17, line 20, an additional hearing that FSOC would be undertaking. So you've got an additional layer and complication to a complicated process within FSOC. And even more fundamentally, in my opinion, in my view, And we had this little discussion yesterday. I'm reading the book on the creation of the Dodd-Frank Act right now, which you are prominently a part of, as are a few of my other colleagues on the upper part of this dais, a few over on this side. All I know is I'm dealing with the echo effects, and here's one of the echo effects. What I do know, not having sat in this chair when I voted or when you all voted on creating Dodd-Frank, I do know that FSOC was not created to be a regulator. You are now having FSOC fulfill a regulator's job. And FSOC was never intended to be a regulator. So now it seems to be it's on its way to be a super regulator. So if one hearing and regulation from FSOC is good, I guess two must be even better in your view. And so we've got a policy, we've got a process issue, but we definitely have a policy foul here, and I'm going to save some of my other remarks on this. But I mean, FSOC was established to monitor systemic risk within the U.S. financial system. Systemic risk. Okay, having a power company owning an ILC that provides funding and loans for weatherization, which is an actual example. They have now sold it, but I had a constituency company in Michigan that owned an ILC in Utah that offered weatherization, new windows. We're going to put weather strips on. We're going to increase your energy efficiency. How in the world is that possibly a systemic risk to the U.S. financial system? It's not. So here, okay, I just heard an off-mic comment of it is, there are 25 ILC institutions that have 1.4% of all of the domestic banking assets. 1.4%. So there's a whole lot of us over on this side that have a very healthy, and I put myself in this category, a very healthy skepticism of a number of these large, often online companies and retailers that may be alluded to and that Mr. Garcia talked to, and that they somehow would create a monopoly situation. All right. However, there is another process to examine those monopoly situations. FSOC is not designed to do this. It is not intended to do this. I would argue it doesn't have the expertise to do this, and that's why I am opposed to this amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute. So we're going to have another substantive conversation, but with that, I think I will yield back.
Who seeks recognition, please? Mr. Barr?
Not on this.
Not on this amendment. Who seeks
I do,
recognition?
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Sessions is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, with great respect, as I started the first time to you and Mr. Garcia, I believe that your ideas are well intended that ran into some debate in not only in this committee, but debate from outside this committee. Organizations that I strongly support and organizations that are important to our economy. But what's happened is that we've now taken this, what was the original 5912, which I am a strong supporter of, has now found itself, as the gentleman from Michigan has talked about, it has changed not just to an amendment, but to a substitute. And I do not believe that we should move forward at this time. I believe that there should be discussion, debate about this. I think my colleagues who I value, including the gentleman, Mr. Huizenga, the gentleman, Mr. Barr, the gentleman, Mr. McHenry, and others, sincerely have a difference, as I do too, about FSOC. And I talked to the Treasury Secretary just last week about the FSOC and their role and responsibility to handle the things that are in front of them, including reality. And I don't think this is the right thing. And so it is with huge reluctance that I say, I think this needs to be reworked. I respect Mr. Garcia. I respect even my sponsorship of this, but at no time that I know of was I negotiated, have I tried to even been touched base with about this by Mr. Garcia, and that's not against him. We're all busy, but I think now's the wrong time to do that. So evidently Mr. Garcia has some ideas about this, and so.
Does the gentleman wish a colloquy with Mr. Garcia?
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Gentleman
you.
is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Sessions. Let me just clarify several things that have been suggested or implied. I want to first note that this amendment has been in the public realm for more than 24 hours. The printed copies were, of course, just distributed, but it's been out there for over 24 hours. With respect to the assertion made earlier that this creates another FSOC hearing, it does not. That is not the case. That is not the implication of the amendment. The amendment simply clarifies that ILCs can challenge an FSOC determination once that determination has been made. It strengthens ILC's ability to challenge FSOC. Moreover, nothing in the amendment entails strengthening of FSOC's regulatory power. FSOC will merely review changes of control. Their FSOC criteria reviewing only matters pertaining to financial stability and nothing more. So I want to make that perfectly clear that that is what this amendment does, and that the amendment has in fact been in the public domain for over 24 hours, and I say that most respectfully.
Thank you. And I do control the time, and I thank the gentlewoman, and I thank the gentleman, Mr. Garcia. I think that I don't understand why it was put if they would not have a say in the matter. And so it's unclear to me whether they would be given that authority to approve or disapprove, or whether a hearing, what a hearing's for. And so these are the types of things that, with respect to the gentleman, because we started off clearly on the right, on the side, the same side. And so I would just offer as a challenge back to the gentleman. I think that I would like to have this worked a little bit better. I think it's better for this committee. I think it's better for our original intent. We want and need to make sure we get this right. And I think getting it right is more important than doing it. So I would just say that to the sponsor of the amendment and of the substitute. And I thank the gentlewoman for her time.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And I guess I share some of the concerns that have been raised by Mr. Huizinga, by Mr. Sessions. This bill has been difficult from the outset, because we're dealing not just with Dodd-Frank, but also with Glass-Steagall. We're dealing with the separation of banking and commerce, which was so important. You know, the Depression was as a result of combination of commerce and banking, and when commerce stalled, banking failed, and we ended up with the Depression. So it's two bills, two major laws that we have to consider. And I think that's why this has been a pretty difficult needle for Mr. Garcia to thread. I think this amendment, and it may be, we can work on it between now and Rules Committee or something like that. The amendment really is designed, it's not regulatory really in scope. It's dealing with what the FOC does, the Stability Committee. And that is, does, say, Amazon's purchase and transfer from Pitney Bowes of an ILC create systemic risk? Because now you've got a major commercial player buying a bank and owning a bank. And that's what we're trying to manage here. It's been difficult, and I applaud my friend from Illinois because he's had a lot of people give him suggestions on this. And it's not easy because we're dealing with really two major pillars of banking law, Dodd-Frank and Glass-Steagall, as he's trying to manage this and allow, for those industrial loan corporations that are in place, deal with ones that may come down the pike and allow for some level of innovation. So I don't think this amendment is a problem. It really just says, okay, is this new company that's buying the ILC so big that it creates a systemic risk, which is what the focus and jurisdiction of the Financial Stability Oversight Committee is all about.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield first to the chair, and then I'll yield to my friend from Michigan.
Is it your understanding that FSOC has an opportunity to review and to make sure that whatever regulations are appropriate would be in place? And is it also your understanding that there is an opportunity to appeal the decision of FSOC?
The answer is yes. The second, on the appeal of FSOC, I'm not sure of that.
Gentleman yield? Part of the conversation gentleman yield just for a
go ahead.
second. Part of the conversation we just had was a discussion about whether they did have any power. And I think the gentleman, Mr. Garcia, to me, indicated they didn't have that power, and now we're talking about they do have that power. This is the kind of thing that I'm speaking about. I want to be for H.R. 5912. I don't know enough about this substitute. And these are the kinds of things, even here with us in an open room, I don't think we've got clear. I thank the gentleman for his time.
All right, I'd yield to my friend from Illinois.
Thank you, the gentleman from Colorado. To Mr. Sessions' concerns, they're well taken. However, I want you to know that your co-sponsorship and your support for this bill is truly appreciated, and I want to move forward with you together. I would ask that you take that under consideration and that we work together on this bill. I am willing to do everything humanly possible to discuss this further with you, with other stakeholders as well, and to get as much clarification as possible. Again, the amendment to the ANS simply seeks to clarify intent. It fortifies the standing of ILCs as it relates to the FSOC and with respect to what their purview on these matters is, and that is simply to opine and to decide on matters pertaining to
Mr.
financial
Garcia.
risk and stability.
I have to yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair raises the question of whether or not the two individuals, Mr. Sessions and Mr. Garcia, would like to have a recess to talk about this.
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. I would like to just simply say that I know the Rules Committee. I've been on it for 20 years, and they need to get a cleaner opportunity to get it right. And I think that I would simply ask that we would be given that chance to get it right. Am I asking the gentleman to pull the bill? Perhaps. I'm not trying to say anything except I don't believe we've got it right here.
The gentleman is in control of the bill.
I would like to move the bill forward and ask your indulgence, and would again do everything possible to address your concerns and to earn your trust, as has been the case from the inception of your support of the bill.
The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair, and my friend from Colorado is going to think he's listening to a broken record here because I'm going to repeat something that I said during the credit union discussion, and that is that a healthy financial ecosystem is one that offers consumers competition and choice. And that's why we need community banks. That's why we need regional banks and globally systemically important large banks for American competitiveness. It's also why we need credit unions and finance companies, non-bank lenders, financial technology firms, and yes, industrial-owned corporations. And I'm sympathetic to some of the concerns of the authors of the Close the ILC Loophole Act. Specifically, large technology companies and commercial firms should not be able to control a full-service FDIC-insured bank without being subject to comparable prudential supervision and regulation. This goes to my point about a level playing field, allowing large technology firms to provide banking services, gaining access to FDIC-insured deposits, and vast amounts of consumer financial data without being subject to the same information security and prudential standards that apply to regulated bank holding companies could create a regulatory imbalance in favor of industrial, commercial, and technology firms, placing traditional banks at an unfair disadvantage and ultimately reducing competition and choice. And that's not what we want. That said, I believe that this bill, Mr. Garcia's bill, the Close the ILC Loophole Act, goes too far in restricting ILCs. In fact, it effectively eliminates all new ILCs. So it's just more of the same from my Democrat colleagues. It's anti-innovation and anti-technology. It's a solution in search of a problem. If we're having an honest discussion about ILCs, we would recognize that most ILCs have a very narrow use by companies to meet specific needs of their customers. In fact, companies looking to offer new financial products have consistently looked to mechanisms other than ILCs to reach consumers because ILCs are not a good fit outside a narrow set of circumstances. Effectively eliminating new ILCs, as this bill would do, sends the wrong message to technology and novel solutions that can reach underserved consumers. So this is not about leveling the playing field. It's an example of committee Democrats creating roadblocks for fintechs to reach underserved communities. Let's not forget that these are the same members of Congress that blocked bank partnerships with fintechs just last summer. If that wasn't enough, this bill would fundamentally change the role of FSOC to that of a microprudential regulator. This is what my friend, the gentleman from Michigan, was talking about. This is a level of burden not seen elsewhere in the financial system. What are the specific concerns that necessitate this level of scrutiny? I think transforming FSOC into a super regulator in this way is not what is authorized in Dodd-Frank. Committee Republicans said last week that if Democrats didn't like something, they would toss it to FSOC to regulate. Well, here is a perfect example of that. There is no evidence that ILCs pose a systemic risk to the financial system, at least not yet. And so we don't need to change FSOC's mandate. And this bill is unnecessary. If we are serious about financial inclusion and reaching unbanked and underbanked communities, we should be embracing novel ways of extending credit and deposit products. For these reasons, I'm opposed to this bill. I'm open to some kind of measure in the future that would create that level playing field that we're all seeking, but this is not that solution. And for that reason, I'm opposed, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion?
Madam Chair, parliamentary inquiry.
Who seeks recognition?
Huizinga?
Mr. Huizinga, recognized for parliamentary inquiry?
Yeah, parliamentary inquiry. Are we proceeding ahead with the gentleman's amendment? Is the question on the manager's amendment?
We will,
Call the question on the manager's amendment, I guess.
we will pause momentarily. The chair will request the members support the pause momentarily while it is worked out. The sponsor of the amendment and the supporter of the amendment, Mr. Sessions, have talked about what they would like to do, and Mr. Garcia will be, as the author of the bill, will be giving us his answer momentarily. We'll pause. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Madam Chair,
Madam Chair, parliamentary inquiry. Under what time is he being recognized? Someone needs to be
He is not
recognized.
recognizing to strike the last word.
He already has had done that.
He is not doing it again.
Madam Chair,
The gentleman is recognized.
I would ask unanimous consent of the committee.
Parliamentary inquiry. Again, the gentleman from Illinois does not have the time, and a member has to yield to him.
I have a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, I seek unanimous consent to take no further action on this bill. I want to withdraw the bill following my conversation.
I object.
With
I'd like to hold that
gentleman from Texas.
reserve and object. I'm objecting to the unanimous consent, Madam Chair.
The gentleman objects to the author of the bill being able to withdraw the bill so that it can be worked on. He's objecting to the gentleman being able to withdraw his own bill. We'll put it to a vote.
You have to move to withdraw it. He's got to move to withdraw it. There has to be a motion to withdraw it.
Does the gentleman move to withdraw? Does the gentleman move to withdraw?
I do, Madam Chair.
Gentleman withdraws. There's no
Madam
further
Chair,
discussion.
Parliamentary inquiry, is he withdrawing, because he has used both the term amendment and the term bill. Is he moving to withdraw the bill, or is he moving to withdraw this amendment?
The gentleman is moving to withdraw the bill. That's my understanding, because Mr. Sessions has requested that there is much work to be done, and he did not confine that to the amendment. And so the gentleman is moving to withdraw the bill. Is there further discussion? If there's no further discussion,
was just trying to clarify.
Yeah, that's, I know, I got it. But, you know, all we want to do here is make sure.
Yeah, I would reference the bill number, so we just. Yeah.
591.
What is it? They want to put the bill number there. A question has been raised about whether or not the entire bill and all of the amendments in the bill have been withdrawn. So I ask unanimous consent to allow Mr. Garcia to withdraw his bill, H.R. 5912, and both his amendments to the bill without objection. Such is the order. There being no other matters pending before the committee, the chair wishes to inform members that votes will occur at a time that will be determined. The committee stands in recess.
Madeline Dean is on, making sure you can hear me.
Are we counting the people?
So we have 14 Democrats so far.
And how many do we need altogether?
So we need 28. But if
Let's make sure we have our count. So everybody on the platform is a Democrat. The committee will come to order. Do we have a quorum here? I believe. The committee will come to order. Before we begin, I want to review the process we will use for recording votes to ensure that all members can be recorded properly. The clerk will call a member's name twice if a response is not heard the first time. Further, at the end of the roll, the clerk will call the names of any members whose votes were not recorded. Therefore, any members who are unsure if their vote was recorded should refrain from seeking recognition and allow the clerk to continue calling the roll. Members on the platform are reminded that the majority and minority clerks will be verifying that members are both visible and audible in order for their vote to be counted. The committee will now take votes on the pending amendment to H.R. 7732 that was postponed. The question now occurs on amendment number 1, offered by Mr. Huizenga. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney.
No. Sorry. No.
Miss,
Do you see me? No.
Mrs. Maloney votes no.
What?
Okay, here they started.
Miss
So maybe we
Velasquez.
do this from here.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Sherman.
No.
Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Meeks.
No.
Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Green.
Nay.
Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Palmer.
No.
Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes no. Mr. Foster.
No.
Mr. Foster votes no. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gottheimer.
No, Gottheimer votes no.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Gonzalez of Texas votes no.
Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Lawson. Mr. Lawson. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas. Miss Axney.
Axney votes no.
Miss Axney votes no. Mr. Caston.
Caston votes no.
Mr. Caston votes no. Miss Presley. Miss Presley. Mr. Torres.
Torres votes no.
Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes no. Miss Adams.
Adams votes no.
Miss Adams votes no. Miss Talib.
Talib votes no.
Miss Talib votes no. Miss Dean.
Dean votes no.
Miss Dean votes no. Miss Ocasio-Cortez.
Ocasio-Cortez votes no.
Miss Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia is a no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Miss Garcia of Texas.
Garcia, Texas votes no.
Miss Garcia votes no. Miss Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes no.
Miss Williams votes no. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss no.
Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. McHenry.
Aye.
Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Lucas.
Lucas votes yes.
Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions.
Sessions, aye.
Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey.
Posey, yes.
Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Hill.
Aye.
Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Emmer.
Yes.
Mr. Emmer votes aye. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk?
Aye.
Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney?
Aye.
Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson?
Aye.
Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Budd?
Thank you so much.
Madam Chair, how am I recorded?
Mr. Budd?
Does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, is Bobby gonna talk? Is Bobby Scott on?
Mr. Kustoff?
I mean,
Mr. Kustoff
Yes, sir.
votes aye. Mr. Hollingsworth?
one of the
Mr.
most interesting
Hollingsworth
things.
votes aye.
Members, please mute, so that we can hear those who are responding. Thank you.
Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Rose?
Yes.
Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr.
Aye.
Stile? Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Gooden?
Gooden votes aye.
Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Timmons?
Aye.
Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor? I will now go over the members that were missed in the previous order. Mr. Cleaver? Mrs. Beatty?
Mrs. Beatty votes no.
Mrs. Beatty votes no. Mr. Vargas?
Please, one moment, please. Please mute. All right, clerk, please continue.
Mr. Vargas? Mr. Lawson? Mr. San Nicolas? Ms. Presley?
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley, your camera's not on.
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley, your camera is not on.
Ms.
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley?
It's saying it's one. Can you see me? Aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Budd?
I'm so sorry. Madam Chair, I have to change my vote. Presley votes nay.
Ms. Presley, off aye, on no. Mr. Budd? Madam Chairwoman?
No.
Madam Chairwoman votes no.
Hello?
And that concludes that vote, Madam Chairwoman.
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote?
Because you only have, you have Bud and
If not, the clerk will report.
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 22 ayes and 26 noes.
A majority having voted against the amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Lynch. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 7732 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney.
Say no.
Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes aye.
Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman.
Aye.
Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks.
Aye.
Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott.
Mr. Scott votes
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Green.
Green votes yea.
Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Palmer.
aye.
Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster.
Foster, aye.
Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty.
Beatty votes aye.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Geheimer. Mr. Geheimer. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Yes.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Lawson. Mr. Lawson.
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Lawson votes aye. Mr. San Nicholas. Mr. San Nicholas. Ms. Axney.
Yes.
Ms. Axney votes aye. Mr. Caston.
Caston votes aye.
Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley. Mr. Torres.
Torres votes aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Ms. Tlaib.
Lee votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Dean, aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Ocasio-Cortez votes
Ms.
aye.
Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Garcia of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. McHenry.
No.
Mr. McHenry votes no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Posey.
Posey votes no.
Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes no. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes no. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams votes no. Mr. Hill.
No.
Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Emmer.
No.
Mr. Emmer votes no. Mr. Zeldin.
No.
Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Loudermilk.
No.
Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Mooney.
No.
Mr. Mooney votes no. Mr. Davidson.
No.
Mr. Davidson votes no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes no. Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Rose.
No.
Mr. Rose votes no. Mr. Stile.
Nope.
Mr. Stile votes no. Mr. Gooden.
Gooden votes no.
Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Timmons.
No.
Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor. I will now go over the members that were missed in the previous order, starting with Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Vargas, Mr. Gaheimer, Mr. San Nicolas, Ms. Presley, Mr. Budd, Mr. Taylor, and Madam Chairwoman? Madam Chairwoman votes aye. And that concludes that vote, Madam Chairwoman.
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote?
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 25 ayes and 22 noes.
A majority having voted in favor, H.R. 7732, as amended, is reported favorably to the House. The committee will now take the votes that were previously postponed on H.R. 7022. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 7022 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes aye.
Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman.
Aye.
Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks.
Aye.
Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Green.
Green votes yea.
Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Palmer.
Perlmutter votes aye.
Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Himes. Aye. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster.
Foster, aye.
Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gaheimer. Mr. Gaheimer. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Gonzalez of Texas is a yes.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Lawson.
It works.
Aye.
Mr. Lawson votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Axney.
Aye.
Ms. Axney votes aye. Mr. Caston.
Aye.
Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley. Mr. Torres.
Torres votes aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Adams. Ms. Adams. Ms. Tlaib.
Tlaib votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Garcia of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. McHenry.
No.
Mr. McHenry votes no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Posey.
Posey votes no.
Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes no. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes no. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams of Texas votes no. Mr. Hill.
No.
Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Emmer.
No.
Mr. Emmer votes no. Mr. Zeldin.
No.
Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Loudermilk.
No.
Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Mooney.
No.
Mr. Mooney votes no. Mr. Davidson.
No.
Mr. Davidson votes no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes no. Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Rose.
Rose votes no.
Mr. Rose votes no. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Timmons.
No.
Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor. I will now go over the members that were missed in the original order, starting with Mrs. Maloney. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Presley. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes yes.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes no. Mr. Gooden.
Gooden votes no.
Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Taylor. And Madam Chairwoman. Madam Chairwoman votes aye. And that concludes that vote, Madam Chairwoman.
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 24 ayes and 22 noes.
A majority having voted in favor, H.R. 2022 as amended is reported favorably to the House. The committee will now take votes on the pending amendments to H.R. 7716 that were postponed. The question now occurs on amendment number 1 offered by Mr. Hill. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Sherman.
No.
Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Meeks.
No.
Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Green.
Green votes nay.
Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Perlmutter.
Perlmutter votes no.
Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes no. Mr. Foster.
Foster, no.
Mr. Foster votes no. Mrs. Beatty.
Mrs. Beatty votes no.
Mrs. Beatty votes no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gaheimer. Mr. Gaheimer. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Gonzalez of Texas is a no.
Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Lawson.
No.
Mr. Lawson votes no. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Axney.
Axney votes no.
Ms. Axney votes no. Mr. Caston.
Caston votes no.
Mr. Caston votes no. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes no. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes no.
Ms. Adams votes no. Ms. Tlaib.
Tlaib votes no.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Ocasio-Cortez votes no.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Garcia of Texas votes no.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes no.
Ms. Williams votes no. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, no.
Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. McHenry.
Aye.
Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mrs. Wagner.
Aye.
Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey.
Posey votes aye.
Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes aye. Mr. Izinga.
Aye.
Mr. Izinga votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Emmer.
Yes.
Mr. Emmer votes aye. Mr. Zeldin.
Aye.
Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk.
Aye.
Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney.
Aye.
Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson.
Aye.
Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Rose.
Rose votes yes.
Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile. Mr. Gooden.
Gooden votes aye.
Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Timmons.
Aye.
Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor. I will now go over the members that were missed in the previous order. Mrs. Maloney.
Thank you. Vote nay, vote nay, vote nay. Say no, vote nay.
Mrs. Maloney.
No. Maloney votes no.
Mrs. Maloney, you are not on camera.
Did they do it?
Say no.
Hi, Maloney votes no.
Mrs. Maloney votes no. Mr. Cleaver.
What do you think? You think that's a no?
Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gaheimer. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Presley. Mr. Budd.
And that is why I'm going myself, because
Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Taylor. Madam Chairwoman.
No.
Madam Chairwoman votes no. And that concludes that vote, Madam Chairwoman.
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote?
Madam Chair, how am I recognized? How am I recorded?
Ms. Presley, you are not recorded.
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley, you are not on camera.
I'm sorry, it's showing on me. I'm not sure. Can you see me? It's showing over here. Okay.
Yes, we can see you.
Ms.
Yes,
Presley
Presley
votes no.
yes. The clerk will report.
Gottheimer votes no.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no.
The clerk will report.
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 22 ayes and 27 noes.
A majority having voted against the amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on amendment number 2, offered by Mr. Barr. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney. Mrs.
All right, say
Maloney.
nay.
Nay. Maloney votes no.
Mrs. Maloney votes no. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Sherman.
No.
Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Meeks.
No.
Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Scott.
No.
Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Green.
Green votes nay.
Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes no. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gottheimer.
Gottheimer votes no.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Gonzalez of Texas votes no.
Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Lawson.
No.
Mr. Lawson votes no. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Axney.
No.
Ms. Axney votes no. Mr. Caston.
No.
Mr. Caston votes no. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley.
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Torres.
Torres votes no.
Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes no. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes no.
Ms. Adams votes no. Ms. Tlaib.
Lee votes no.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Dean.
Dean, no.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
No.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Garcia of Texas votes no.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes no.
Ms. Williams votes no. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss no.
Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. McHenry.
Aye.
Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes aye. Mr. Posey.
Posey votes aye.
Mr. Posey votes aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes aye. Mr. Izinga. Mr. Izinga votes aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes aye. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams votes aye. Mr. Hill.
Aye.
Mr. Hill votes aye. Mr. Emmer.
Yes.
Mr. Emmer votes aye. Mr. Zeldin.
Aye.
Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk.
Aye.
Mr. Loudermilk votes aye. Mr. Mooney.
Aye.
Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson.
Aye.
Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Rose.
Rose votes yes.
Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile.
Aye.
Mr. Stile votes aye. Mr. Gooden.
Gooden votes aye.
Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Timmons.
Aye.
Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor. I will now go over the members that were missed in the previous order, starting with Mr. Cleaver. Mrs. Beatty. Mr. Vargas. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. Budd. Mr. Taylor. Madam Chairwoman? Madam Chairwoman votes no.
How do you have Congresswoman Beatty recorded?
Mrs. Beatty, you are not recorded.
Congresswoman Beatty votes no.
Mrs. Beatty votes no. And that
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 22 ayes and 27 noes.
A majority having voted against the amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Dean. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 7716 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the House. A recorded vote is requested. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney.
Yes. Yes. Aye. Maloney votes aye.
Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes aye.
Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman.
Aye.
Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks.
Aye.
Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Green.
Green votes yea.
Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Palmer.
Perlmutter votes yes.
Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Himes.
Himes is yes.
Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster.
Foster, aye.
Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gottheimer.
Gottheimer votes aye.
Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Gonzalez of Texas votes aye.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Lawson.
Aye.
Mr. Lawson votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Axney.
Aye.
Ms. Axney votes aye. Mr. Caston.
Aye.
Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley.
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Ms. Tlaib.
Talib votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Dean, aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Ocasio-Cortez, aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia votes aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Garcia of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. McHenry.
No.
Mr. McHenry votes no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Posey.
Posey votes no.
Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes no. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes no. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Emmer.
No.
Mr. Emmer votes no. Mr. Zeldin.
No.
Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Mooney.
No.
Mr. Mooney votes no. Mr. Davidson.
No.
Mr. Davidson votes no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes no. Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Rose.
Rose votes no.
Mr. Rose votes no. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes no. Mr. Gooden.
Gooden votes no.
Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor. I will now go over the members that were missed in the previous order, starting with Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Vargas. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. Budd. Mr. Taylor. And Madam Chairwoman.
Yes.
Madam Chairwoman votes aye. And that concludes that vote, Madam Chairwoman.
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 27 ayes and 22 noes.
A majority having voted in favor of H.R. 7716 as amended is reported favorably to the House. The committee will now take the votes that were previously postponed on H.R. 4395. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 4395 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney.
Maloney votes aye.
Ms. Maloney votes aye. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes aye.
Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman.
Aye.
Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks.
Aye.
Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Green.
Green votes yea.
Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Palmer.
Promoter votes aye.
Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Himes.
Aye.
Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster.
Foster, aye.
Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gottheimer.
Gottheimer votes aye.
Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Gonzalez of Texas votes aye.
Mr. Gonzalez of Texas votes aye. Mr. Lawson.
Aye.
Mr. Lawson votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Axney.
Aye.
Ms. Axney votes aye. Mr. Caston.
Aye.
Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley.
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Ms. Talib.
Talib votes yes.
Ms. Talib votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Garcia Villanoy.
Garcia is an aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Garcia votes aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. McHenry.
No.
Mr. McHenry votes no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Posey.
Posey votes no.
Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes no. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga votes no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes no. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Emmer.
No.
Mr. Emmer votes no. Mr. Zeldin.
No.
Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Mooney.
Aye.
Mr. Mooney.
Aye.
Mr. Mooney votes aye. Mr. Davidson.
Aye.
Mr. Davidson votes aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes no. Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Rose.
Rose votes yes.
Mr. Rose votes aye. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes no. Mr. Gooden.
Gooden votes aye.
Mr. Gooden votes aye. Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor. I will now go over the members that were missed in the previous order, starting with Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Vargas. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. Budd. Mr. Taylor. And Madam Chairwoman. Madam Chairwoman votes aye. And that
Franklin.
concludes.
Can I change off aye on no?
Mr. Timmons off aye on no. That concludes that vote, Madam Chairwoman.
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Madam Chair,
Who seeks recognition?
Posey.
Who is it? Mr. Posey. Of Florida. The gentleman is recognized.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd like to just check my vote on that.
Mr. Posey?
Mr. Posey, you are
Checking
recorded
his-
as no.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. The clerk will report.
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 32 ayes and 17 noes.
A majority having voted in favor, H.R. 4395 as amended, it is reported favorably to the House. The committee will now take the votes that were previously postponed on H.R. 7003. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 7003 as amended to be reported favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney.
Maloney votes aye.
Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes aye.
Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Sherman.
Aye.
Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks.
Aye.
Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Green.
Green votes yea.
Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Himes.
Aye.
Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Foster.
Foster, aye.
Mr. Foster votes aye. Mrs. Beatty.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye.
Mrs. Beatty votes aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Gottheimer.
Gottheimer votes aye.
Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez of Texas.
Gonzalez of Texas votes aye.
Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Lawson.
Aye.
Mr. Lawson votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas. Ms. Axney.
Aye.
Ms. Axney votes aye. Mr. Caston.
Aye.
Mr. Caston votes aye. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley. Mr. Torres.
Presley votes aye.
Ms. Presley votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Hold up. Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Ms. Tlaib.
Tlaib votes yes.
Ms. Tlaib votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Dean votes aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Aye.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois.
Garcia is aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Garcia of Texas.
Garcia of Texas votes aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Williams of Georgia.
Williams of Georgia votes aye.
Ms. Williams votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. McHenry.
No.
Mr. McHenry votes no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions votes no. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey.
Posey votes no.
Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer votes no. Mr. Izinga. Mr. Izinga votes no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes no. Mr. Williams of Texas. Mr. Williams votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Emmer.
No.
Mr. Emmer votes no. Mr. Zeldin.
No.
Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Mooney.
No.
Mr. Mooney votes no. Mr. Davidson.
Nope.
Mr. Davidson votes no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes no. Mr. Gonzalez of Ohio. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Rose.
Rose votes no.
Mr. Rose votes no. Mr. Stile.
Style, no.
Mr. Stile votes no. Mr. Gooden.
Gooden votes no.
Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Timmons.
Nope.
Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor. I will now go over the members that were missed in the previous order, starting with Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Vargas. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. Loudermilk.
No.
Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Taylor. And Madam Chairwoman. Madam Chairwoman votes aye. And that concludes that vote, Madam Chairwoman.
Based on the roll call, it appears all members who are present have voted. Does any member wish to change his or her vote? Not, the clerk will report.
With that vote, Madam Chairwoman, we have 27 ayes and 22 noes.
A majority having voted in favor, H.R. 7003, as amended, is reported favorably to the House. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming amendments to the measure under consideration. This concludes the markup. I thank all of the members, and this meeting is adjourned.